Welcome to Connecting the Dots. I'm Mariana Marques, the Executive Director of Azimuth World Foundation. One of our current grantees is the Fundación Sobrevivencia Cofán, an Indigenous-led organization working to protect the Cofán-Bermejo Ecological Reserve. This Cofán ancestral land in Amazon and Ecuador is threatened by growing numbers of illegal miners. Shortly after awarding our grant, we asked the FSC to share some pictures of the Cofán-Bermejo Reserve. We were very happily surprised to learn that the stunning images they sent us were taken by photographer Kiliii Yuyan, whose work we've been following over the past few years. We're obviously not alone in this respect to Kilii's work. As an award-winning contributor to National Geographic Magazine and other major publications, his stunning images have become powerful conveyors of the stories of human communities connected to the land. From his groundbreaking continuous portrayal of indigenous communities in the Arctic, where he spends months each year, to the moving portraits of Standing Rock protesters, from documenting the burning practice of the Yurok and Karuk nations of Northern California, to his travels in the Navajo Nation, Alaska, Greenland, and Iceland. Kilii's work offers an exploration of the human relationship with the natural world from different cultural perspectives. But this approach and Kilii's biography are inextricably connected, raised by refugee parents in the US and informed by ancestry that is both Nanai Hèzhé, East Asian Indigenous, and Chinese American photography was, as he puts it, one of the ways that would bring me home in this case. And his commitment to indigenous communities goes beyond his images. A member of Indigenous Photograph and Diversity Photo, Kiliii actively advocates for the rendering of indigenous narratives by indigenous storytellers. He also builds traditional kayaks and contributes to the revitalization of North Indigenous East Asian culture. We are so grateful to have Kiliii on today, and we're also very happy to have Jim Kambeitz as today's discussions partner. Jim is a member of Azimuth's Advisory Committee. As a co-founder of Upward Spiral Films, he has worked to train local native and non-native North Dakotans to build their own film industries while cultivating understanding and better relationships among his community. Kiliii, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you, Jim, as well, and please take it away.
Well, welcome, Kiliii. And I spent the last weekend watching a lot of your films and looking at your images and reading your thoughts. And yeah, you have so many great insights into two things that I love: documentary as a subject. Both I'm a documentary filmmaker, but you're a documentary photographer and also filmmaker. And I think of this watching your journey, and I think, wow, this process of documenting light writing must have changed your life a lot. What is the impact it has had on you having this career choice?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's great question, Jim. Actually, it's not something I think that anyone has ever asked me before, so it's lovely to hear. Documentary did change my life quite a lot, I would say. I started photography very late in my life, in my early 30s, and then I did commercial photography for a while, and I think that was good. It was allowed me to learn the technical stuff. But then, I did it for a short while, like a year and a half, and then I got burnt out selling things to people very quickly, and so I realized that I needed to do something, and I found a consultant, and she basically said, "You are a very interesting person and come from an interesting background, and it's important for you to investigate that. It's important for you to look at stuff like documentary instead of commercial work." And at the time, I was like, "Well, sure." I didn't really think that much of it, but as I started to go down the rabbit hole, I started to realize that it was incredibly powerful. In the commercial and advertising worlds, you're not so much learning and discovering what is going on. You're not looking for insights in the world. You're kind of crafting messages for people to essentially sell things, and it's a very, very different kind of feeling. And the first place that I had to go was that I had to really sort of dive into the complicated family politics that are in my life that I grew up with, but also I mostly try to avoid between the indigenous side of my family, the part of the family that most of the rest of the family was just Chinese and ran away from the communist revolution. And so there were a lot of really difficult things in there that untangling those things, I sort of realized over time were going to be my road towards becoming a better photographer. But ultimately, it really helped me heal as a human being, helped me like get closer to my family, helped me understand humanity better, and going down this road like really helped me learn a lot more about what it means to be human in a very complicated world full of deep, difficult history. Yeah, and it was just the very beginning, but it certainly started me down that road. And I'm much more empathetic, compassionate human being that's much more interested in how things became the way they are than I used to be. So that was a really monumental change in my life for sure.
Sure. Well, in your background, it's because you have ancestry that's Nanai and indigenous people in Siberia, and then you also have Chinese lineage as well, and then you grew up in America. So it's like three extremely different worlds. They're almost like three opposites in a triangle. And I know you've mentioned that you felt there's invisibility in some areas of your past as far as being represented or not represented in the media. And there's indigeneity, there's a visibility question, and there's photography. And what happens when you take a photo? Is it, and even the language of photography, some people say it's so aggressive and warlike. You take or you shoot somebody, or you grab that. So how a person approaches photography, photo meaning light, and graphy writing, so light writing, or what is photography for you? I know I've read a lot of interesting words that you've shared about it. Things like a photo is the period at the end of a sentence. And I'm wondering, can you explain how you feel about photography and or these three worlds that interconnect for you?
Well, that particular statement, photography, is making a photograph, like actually clicking the shutter, is a period at the end of a sentence, and that's a quote that I can't actually remember where I came by it, and it's a bummer because I say it a lot, because it encapsulates how I feel about making photographs quite a bit. But the thing about photography is that that particular statement really is in some ways even more better suited to storytelling in general, like photographic storytelling. When you're making a film, the sort of bringing in all the pieces together at the end in the editing process is it's not just a period, it's a whole chunk of the sentence, right? It's a very, very large segment of what it is that you do. With a photograph, a lot of the sort of technical magic happens in just that moment when you click that shutter. But what no one ever sees, and we often are trying to help people understand, is that a photograph isn't just you happen to be standing there at the right time in the right place and able to take that photograph. People don't think very much about how it is you got to be there at the right time in the right place with the right set of relationships, so that people don't immediately look at you and are like, what are you doing here? And kick you out. So one of the reasons I really love photography that is actually different than, say, photography and writing, in the sort of old school way of doing things, in the classical photo essay, or the classic sort of New York Times or National Geographic story, is that we're really very non-invasive. Like, we can go in and do work, and it could just be me. I could be there for 6 months, and eventually the community that I'm working in, I become a part of that community, which is really lovely. And it's not it's very different than maybe the old school mentality of a fly on the wall. Like I'm not really a fly on a wall per se. I suppose you could think of it that way, but I'm a fly on a wall only because I'm just part of the workings of the clock now. You know, like I'm actually there and I'm part of it. And this is one of the things I find difficult about filmmaking. Actually, many types of filmmaking is that you have a crew generally of many people, and as soon as you have more than one person, the dynamic changes. You're no longer really able to just kind of fold into what goes on, but you kind of suddenly you're your own thing. You're like a much more substantial force. So it's very, very, very different kind of thing. But yeah, the photograph for me, like photography and storytelling are very, very much the same. You know, documentary really changed me in that way. I don't really think about photographs as standalone single images anymore. You know, it's always telling a story. And I just find that far more powerful and far more interesting in a way, like, you know, like the photo essay or a series of photographs is kind of the happy medium for me between something like taking a single picture versus making a film. Just right in between there. You're able to actually deliver a message, which it's very difficult to do that with a single photograph, even with a caption. But it's not at the opposite end of things where it's so, it changes the situation so much while you're making it that you're able to actually get something that sort of, you're sort of to spin out a thread of truth that I think would be really difficult to make otherwise.
And
I'm not sure if that's where you're going with that, but there it is.
sure. Your work, you know, I think you explained it in that you build a relationship and you might have to stay there for 6 months. How do you build that trust, and what happens in this process, and why do you do it this way?
Well, I think building the trust now is a little bit easier for me because I have a lot of experience around small communities and indigenous communities and communities that are not my own culture. You know, I recognize, like, you know, mostly, you know, even though all these other cultures, my experience is mostly that of an American immigrant. You know, and so I tend to see things first and foremost through the lens of like this kind of weird Western viewpoint, which is really unusual in the world. Most of the world doesn't really see life and existence the same way, and but most of these storytellers come from the West, and so the first thing that it's the first part of my life has been spending enough time around other communities to kind of get to know the rules, and there's a lot. You know, I mean, there's a really fundamental difference. And I think this is the hardest thing for anyone to, I can say it in a second, but it's really hard for me to do in practice. And the statement is basically, you know, in Western culture, people have rights. And in non-Western cultures, people have responsibilities, they have obligations. You know, in the West, you can do anything you want to unless you're told otherwise. Most of the rest of the world, you can't do anything unless you're specifically allowed to. You know, it's a very different thing. It's almost the opposite. Not quite. You know, there's a lot of in between. But it is a little bit like that. You know, Native communities, especially, are very much at the far end of that spectrum. You know, you have to ask the permission of your elders, and until you know what you can and can't do in a culture, you can sort of assume that you can't really do anything. You know, and so spending a lot of time around small communities and Native communities, you start to learn the rules that are somewhat applicable across the board, you know, and then and that helps a lot in terms of being able to do it. Like, for example, you know, when it's really common for someone from New York, say, to go to India and to, you know, just like land in Mumbai and then wander around the rural areas and be like, hey, look, these are really cool people. And, you know, many Indian people love being photographed. They don't really have trouble being photographed, but there are lots of things for which it's really not okay to photograph. And you land there and so you feel like, oh gosh, some people love being photographed. This country must, you know, this country, and that generalization is that, you know, you can photograph anything. But there's many things you can't, and you sort of like, so especially when you get into rural communities, people will really hate on you if you are pulling the camera out at inappropriate times, taking pictures of things that shouldn't be, that they can't photograph themselves, you know, that they can't do it on their, they're not even allowed to with their camera phones, you know. And so like understanding that and paying attention and observing, and just like even just starting from that place of like, I need to spend some time here to get to know what's going on is the biggest thing. The other thing, of course, is at some point, it really helps to have, you know, like to build trust in the community. You go there, really helps to be introduced the right way. You know, like at this point in time, I have a pretty large network of people that I know that can introduce me. But it's not always easy, especially, you know, the further away that you get from your network, the harder it is. There are places like Mongolia where I have to reach out to people who, like fixers, because I don't know anybody that knows someone that knows me directly. So you have to like, you can't just sort of do introductions that way, and you just have to go in humbly and quietly and slowly, and then go in with the expectation that you're going to spend a month there. You know, like at a minimum, you're going to spend a month there, and nothing worth photographing is going to happen in the first couple of weeks because there's no trust there yet. So it's really hard. I think if you are like a tourist with a short amount of time to do something, just kind of know that it's tough to do it on the first trip when you only have a week. It's really difficult.
Yeah. You can see that your images have a different approach, and it is that to get to that quality, to get to that intimacy of an image or uniqueness, and to get to that National Geographic level, let's just, you know, use that as a kind of sort of benchmark. But of course, your work is expansive in so many realms in the film and every other realm. That, you know, the journalism part of it and the nature journalism part of it is just a fraction of it. You're really revealing a lot about humanity, and it shows that you have to spend a lot of time in order to do that right. And you have little details that, like a little land acknowledgement in the end of, you know, Lens of the World, and a lot of other things that seem so simple, but it seems like the rest of the photography world and even documentary filmmaking world hasn't caught on to yet. Where did you learn to like honor the indigenous traditions and do simple things like land acknowledgements and things like that? What was that process like?
Honestly, those things are, I feel like, almost like very basic sort of things. In a way, you could say with land acknowledgements, I almost feel like I've moved beyond land acknowledgements. Certainly in the indigenous community, we feel like land acknowledgement is like the place that you start from, and then eventually you can do away with it because the story itself you're telling, the whole thing is a land acknowledgement. But, you know, I think it really helps to be a part of the greater community. And I think this is a tough thing in general for a lot of storytellers who don't come from the community that they're going to cover. Because there is a network of people, if you're in Latin America or Central America or Amazonia or, Micronesia, all of those places have their own specific network of people for whom, if you kind of tune into the conversation, and it's actually not that hard these days, like Twitter, for example, it's easy to get on into Twitter and just really listen to what people are saying. And yeah, it's a huge garbage patch, Twitter is, but there are other places, like Facebook, and also places like Indigenous Photograph, which is the collection of professional photographers who are all have Indigenous ancestry. And so it's not, I don't know, I feel like you get involved in that community in some way. You're not just working inside your own tiny little bubble, which I do think it's really easy for freelancers to do. Even freelance filmmakers who have to work with other people, you're like inside of your own little world, and reaching out and beyond that is really tough. I often sort of feel like I'm, I'm Chinese and I'm Nanai and I'm an immigrant first. I'm all those things. Like I'm a son and an uncle before I'm a photographer. And like I think if you don't think that, then you don't think those things, then you don't think of yourself as a human first. It can be a little tough to be a part of other communities. Where so much of the West is like, especially every day it goes on, we're pounded more and more into this notion of being individuals and fighting, like, sort of, I guess you could say, sometimes I feel like fighting all of the tendencies that capitalism and individualism, all these kinds of things, the more they fight those tendencies in our own lives, the more power it gives us, just because everyone else is doing the exact opposite thing. Swimming upstream is really useful because then you have a unique skill set. And you should want to look at it from a pure efficiency perspective, which I am Asian, so it's hard to get away from that.
Well, and my wife and I, we've traveled a lot all over the planet for many years, and we had a very similar observation like you, where it's almost like America is doing its own thing, and then all the rest of the world is completely different and in a different.
Yeah, that's right.
It's sometimes you're in India and you feel like you're in South America or even other European countries. It's just like, so the word, I guess, that's been really popular is colonization, and is American media than the rest of the world's media, and what's the future, and what should media move towards? I feel like you have a strong critique of media and what it should do, and I think what you do shows another way. How would you summarize what that is, or what you wish the world would understand, or other media makers would understand when they make content?
Well, I think that the first and foremost thing that's already happening in the world, the biggest thing that actually National Geographic explorer Noel Cox said, he's a Kenyan who's really well spoken. So I'm just quoting his words. He says, "If you want to change the story, change the storyteller." Like that carries. It's a little bit more. There's like that's not the full sentiment that I would say. I would say, in a sense, we're not trying to get rid of the way that people still tell stories in the colonial bastion that is America. We are just trying to add voices to that story, to the stories. It's the most important thing. Like, sure, it's really cool to see what an American person thinks when they like go to Hokkaido to photograph cranes or snow monkeys. But it's even more interesting to see, like, well, what does a Chinese photographer, what does a Russian photographer see when they go to those places? What does a Japanese person who lives there see when they see those places? They come away with really different things, and it's not even a question of like, that's just a wildlife nature thing. There's not this sort of deep cultural thing. Yet when you start to look at the pictures, you start to realize, actually, there is really different. The Japanese people see snow monkeys in a totally different way. Actually, some of my favorite work I've done over there is by Jasper Doest, who is Dutch, and he goes over there to Japan and he's looking at it. It's still got kind of a European vibe to it, but he's looking at snow monkeys and monkeys in like where a lot of the animals themselves are like used for human purposes, and so that's the thing that catches his attention. Whereas the Japanese, by and large, that's sort of like such a daily part of their existence. It's sort of unnoticeable to a Japanese person, to many Japanese people, So yeah, I think that's the first thing, is that more storytellers equals better. The other thing, though, that's happening in the journalism world, I think it's really wonderful, is there's a move to what we call solutions journalism. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. It's certainly in America, and there's something called the Solutions Journalism Network. think at this point in time, people are just really tired of hearing like, oh, climate change, this, everything's falling apart, the world is falling apart. Particularly in America, we have the most negative media in the world. It drives sales, so I get it. But like the truth is, the world isn't really any more negative than it was 100 years ago. Like in a way, you look at like life 150 years ago, and life was far more terrible for the majority of people, not for everybody, but for the majority of people. And so yet if you look at a newspaper now, you would think that the world is just like burning up in flames, and everything is, we're all doomed to the apocalypse any moment. Solutions journalism is just this notion like, actually, most of the problems that we need to solve have already been solved somewhere. Maybe not at the scale that we need to, not this, we haven't solved climate change, but there's all these little local ways in which climate change issues have been tackled very significantly. People are doing it in the Amazon. I mean, shoot, you're talking about like hunter-gatherers, like the Cofán you guys are working with, to do it in the Amazon. And it's amazing, like with no resources. And of course, you hear all the regular stuff. Elon Musk is doing it with Tesla, like the exact opposite way. People are doing it in all kinds of ways. And when we report on solutions, it's people pay a lot more attention.
And you just mentioned and that ecological reserve is really dear to us, and that was why we.
Yeah.
And could you tell us a little bit, share some of your stories or impressions from your time there in that community?
Yeah, the Cofán are an amazing culture. Those 5 communities are they're lovely. They're all really kind of different from each other, so they're really amazing. I was so incredibly impressed because my contact / host / fixer / do everything person was Ugo Lusitante. And Ugo is a young person who was basically, when he was just a child, like 10 years old, had to leave his community to learn Spanish, and then went to the United States later. Actually moved to Seattle, which is really funny because I'm here in Seattle, but I had no idea he was here as a young person. And then he did college at Brown University. He learned English. He did all these things. I mean, he started as hunter-gatherer, like as a 10-year-old. All he wanted to do was catch fish and hunt for pacas. And so and didn't speak anything other than Ainge. So for him, it's really like a traumatic experience to be ripped out from the forest and living in this life, which is not to say there's not like, there wasn't anything modern or anything like that, but the world is very different that he inhabits now. And you really see it. So he's now a leader. And like the thing that Ugo had to do is actually a strategy that the Cofán do in order to save themselves, save their forest from being destroyed, save their homes from being destroyed. Like they realized a long while ago in the like late 80s, early 90s, that sending someone to the outside world to learn how to speak the language of law, to speak the language of environmental conservation, all that was really helpful to them. And so they keep doing it. They kind of keep sending people who are appropriate. Oftentimes they're the people who are like, I think the elders kind of recognize the families and the young people who are best suited, who are the most responsible, the least selfish, who are able to go out and do the community something. And it's kind of terrible because it's like it's a horrible, almost sentence in a way. People have been doing it since the beginning of time, but it's almost a sentence in a way. We're going to banish you, Prince of the Cofán, to go to this foreign land to learn their ways so that you can come back and help us all, and it's kind of an amazing thing. So my impression of it is that the Cofán are these hunter-gatherers who are surrounded by other indigenous peoples in this forest, but that even though the world is day by day is like falling apart and changing really dramatically, that they still have these amazing strategies that take advantage of the modern world and are able to kind of wield it almost like a weapon. And it's really impressive. I don't think that, it's just one of many strategies that they have. And lots of indigenous communities have something have things like this, but the Cofán are particularly good at it, I would say. I think probably because more than anything, they've had more threat to their lands and to their livelihood for longer than anyone else in Latin America, just about, at least in terms of oil development on their land. So they're really impressive. But yeah, they live such a beautiful life over there. You know, because some people work really hard, like Ugo. There are lots of people in the communities that are able to live relatively simple, I wouldn't say carefree, but, you know, like relatively simple lives that are not that far off from the way that they lived, you know, 100 years ago. Like it might not look the same. The clothing is different. There's lots of modern tools and things like that. But in their heart, you know, sort of the spirit of the way they care themselves and how they spend their free time and what they enjoy doing, they're still able to do most of that. Fishing, hunting, medicinal plants, shamanism, all those things still exist. It's amazing when you think about how much the outside world is trying to destroy all of that in the process of getting resources from the Amazon.
Unknowingly destroying it, you know.
Yes, unknowingly destroying it. Out of sight, out of mind. Yeah.
Normal things that we eat, whatever things we buy for our houses, not knowing the fact for sure. And you know, when you're in a culture like that, an ancient culture, and seeing all these natural indigenous ways that our ancestors all thrived on, wherever we were from, there was a connection to the earth in a very different world. And then do you ever stop and think about the person who's going to read this in a National Geographic or somewhere else in New York City or some other city, and you think about that viewer, the audience, and what's that like for you?
You know, when I think of the audience, the first audience I always think of is the community who I'm covering. Like I want, I know when the story comes out that I'm going to get a bunch of copies and the Cofán are going to get them. And probably the biggest effect it's going to have, period, is that young Cofáns are going to get it and they're going to see someone like Ugo in there and they're going to be like, oh my God, that's my uncle, you know? You know, that's my uncle fishing. And it makes them want to be like just proud to be who they are. Proud to be, you know, like it makes things like fishing look really cool compared to the alternatives that are beckoning all the time, which might be to go to the city and get a job in an office or something like that. So I think that's the biggest one. But the other, you know, I do think the other audiences are, of course, important. There are lots of influences in the world. And oftentimes I think when we're writing the story, both me and the writer, we're always thinking about, you know, the amount of influence that we have, especially at National Geographic. And so it's great that people all over the world are going to see it, particularly these like rich, wealthy countries are going to see it. But where the places really aimed at, in some ways, are the influential people who are on the border, who don't know much necessarily about indigenous issues, don't know that supporting these small indigenous communities with a very small amount of money can have dramatic consequences, not just for the people and not just for human rights, but dramatic consequences for things that they really care about, like the Amazon rainforest, for climate change, you know, like these really huge things. And just these people who might like be on the fence politically or be on the fence, you know, in terms of their education about, like, it might even, actually, sometimes it's really targeted towards people, and a lot of people know a lot about the environment, but know very little about the fact that indigenous peoples occupy some 40% of the world's natural areas, like pristine natural areas, where there's no way we're going to conserve 30% of the world's natural areas by 2030 without including indigenous peoples in a massive way. It's just not going to happen. So I think that National Geographic is the place for a lot of people to sort of, not only just for the first time encountering this information, but just to push people over the edge. You might have been thinking like, oh, indigenous peoples, mostly what you hear about them is protests and you know, like you hear a lot of sort of negative things about them unless it's drumming or dancing. And what I'm trying to help those people understand is actually they hold all the keys to the environment these days. You know, indigenous communities hold all the keys to the environment. And yeah, like the rest of the rich, wealthy countries have to do stuff about the other things, the Canadian boreal forest and all that. But there's so much that if you support Native communities can be done for not that much money. Yeah, it's like very pragmatic just from that point of view.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And you hear different numbers. Sometimes I've read up to 85% of the world's biodiversity is in indigenous land, controlled by indigenous people. Some say 40. You know, I've heard a lot of different numbers on different variables, but the overarching message is always that why don't we have a system in place to do this? And maybe decolonization is the Western way to start entering into that consciousness. I love how you described it there, as you know, you can do the most with the littlest amount. You can help the world in the most with the very littlest by getting it indigenous-led. And I know there's a land back movement, which scares a lot of traditional landowners. Hear that movement, and there's a lot happening right now. It's like we've rocketed forward in the last 4 years, especially, or 6 years, and maybe even decade. But you know, some people say that a lot of that was connected to the movement at Standing Rock, and that sort of united a lot of the indigenous folks from the whole planet, and reignited fire. What was your experience? Or what are your thoughts?
I don't think it's just Standing Rock. I think it's also Black Lives Matter, actually. You know, it's kind of funny that there's sort of like political movements that seem like they're on the edge there. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of weird in a sense. Maybe even Trump pushed this all over the edge because the backlash against politically, the backlash against Trump helped a lot of people. A lot of really intense people on the left start to just sort of realize, well, we can't wait anymore. We need to push back against this kind of stuff. It's kind of funny, actually, that I mentioned like the progressive left in some ways, because I think in some ways the story that I'm working on right now that includes the Cofán is actually very much targeted towards actually the progressive left, because progressive left in the West in general, a lot of that people that are older, that haven't been keeping up with what's been happening in the last 5 years or so, a lot of them, or just maybe not on board, they're older, come for a different time, just don't realize how much this idea that natural areas and human beings don't mix is like embedded in their psyches. In the West, really, this is very, 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 very strong notion that if you add humans or leave humans in nature, that nature will be destroyed. And that's the key thing. I'm talking about pushing people over the edge. This is one of the key ideas we're trying to kind of help people realize is not the case. When you look around the world, it's very, very clear that the places where there are indigenous peoples living, those are the places that are left. Well, the pristine air, 40% of the world's pristine areas are left because indigenous peoples are on them. You know, they're not national parks. I always use this like great statistic. It's very revealing in some ways. Like the Cofán, I think they estimate that the Cofán area of land is about the size of Yosemite National Park in the US, or Yellowstone, about the same size, is about 1.5 times the size of Yosemite. And the Cofán spend about $30,000 a year in order to maintain their land. You know, currently it's not enough, but that's how much they get in order for people to be able to take the time to do the legal work and to be able to just support people like with some rice or food or even like childcare while they're dealing with all these legal issues. Yosemite, on the other hand, has a budget of $33 million a year. It's like, orders of magnitude greater than the amount of money that the Cofán has. And sure, Yosemite is beautiful and it's pristine. There's more going on in Yosemite, so it does cost more, of course. But think about that: 30,000 versus $33 million. That's a huge, huge, huge difference. So I mean, and yeah, that's also that essentially Yosemite can be conserved without human beings living in it. Crazy.
Wow. And if one sits back and thinks about Native American indigenous populations here on this continent, they would be, shaking their head all over. I mean, it's like they've been telling. I've spent the last 6 years a lot of time with the local indigenous people here, and just saying, okay, I want to learn to see through your eyes. I want to understand, and it's unbelievable when you look at national parks through indigenous eyes, and when you look at the whole of America through indigenous eyes, that shift that happened. And with your work and the way you're talking about things, it's you're really arguing for a shift for man to start seeing themselves as connected again, and relationality. And you had a quote where you said that, I don't remember it exactly, but it was something to the effect of they're people with like a whale body or a fish body or in a fish suit or something like to communicate to us that each being is the equal level and deserves the equal respect that we have. Are there other things like that you wish people would understand in the normal pop culture world, or are there things like that you just you're dying for people to get through your photos, and that's what comes out in the art?
Yeah, I mean, to tell you the truth, I think that honestly, the land teaches us if we're listening. Oh, by the way, before I tackle a question, I also need to show you. Let's see, I think I got it. Oh yeah, here. So this was the cover from July's National Geographic. Yeah, the first thing you see is Quanah chasing a horse. But the other thing that you see in the background, this is the reason you shot it here, shot this cover image here, is because that's Monument Valley. Monument Valley in Utah/Arizona. This famous, iconic photographic location, one of the most beautiful places in the world, And this is, I think, one of the things that almost nobody in the world knows, unless you live in the Southwest, is that Monument Valley has Navajo Dene living in it, as it always has. It's a sacred place, but sacred does not mean not having people. In fact, sacred specifically means you have people there to take care of it. And I think this is that it's like there could be no better way to think about it. What a major difference. Like Monument Valley is a Navajo Nation tribal park. It's their national park, and very, very different than, say, Arches National Park, which has no humans. And once again, the cost for maintaining it is gigantic compared to Monument Valley. So yeah, that's right.
The federal government needs to understand. I mean, is that being communicated? Is there a chance that national parks can have a shift towards indigenous care more so?
I think so, but I think that what's going to end up happening, I think the national park system is its own thing at this point in time, and that's totally fine. I think there's plenty of room actually for there to be parks that already have had the people removed for a long time, for them to continue going on, because people do enjoy that. And it's its own thing now. It's created, it's not going anywhere. But I do think that as sovereignty goes back to tribal nations, that a lot of the places that they have held sacred, they're going to continue to keep them sacred. And you will find out places like, for example, with the Blackfoot Confederacy, they've got beautiful land near Glacier National Park. Glacier is obviously really incredible, but the Blackfoot are doing creating their own Blackfoot tribal park over there as well, and it's going to be extremely gorgeous, and there are going to be people living on it. And because they're sovereign, they get to make the rules, and they get to make the rules about how that national park will be, who's going to be there and who's not, and all that kind of stuff. And so as we continue to see the sovereignty of Native peoples increase all around the world, they can do these things, you know, and in some sense, it almost even like ups the ante, you know, like now, as soon as the Blackfoot say that they're creating this, this tribal national park, well, all eyes are on them. They know that they can't really mess it up. Like this is a great opportunity for them basically to show everyone, hey, we got this thing, look how beautiful it is. This is a national treasure here in the United States, and we're taking care of it. So yeah, it's I think that's really the road forward.
Well, and with photography involving more Indigenous people, as you say, not just the content, but the photographer, that's going to shift a lot of stuff.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's certainly going to shift. Yeah, there's stuff that people from inside the communities themselves especially know, or have heard, or the context that they have is so much deeper, you know, having lived their whole lives there or around it, you know, like there's things that we'd never know otherwise. Like I was just talking to Kamina Weasel Moccasin, who's Blackfoot on the Alberta side or the Canadian side, and she was a park ranger at Writing on Stone, which is this provincial British Columbia or Alberta provincial park, which is a beautiful place where there's these big hoodoos kind of standing up, this sandstone-like monuments standing up, and there's a bunch of petroglyphs all over. It's obviously a park because it's amazing. And you go and you see all of these petroglyphs tapped into the stone. Some of our pictographs also, like, they're painted onto the stone. And some of them are very old, thousands of years old. It's amazing that they've survived so long. And when lots of people like look at certain, you know, she's I think she's the only, at the time that she was a ranger, she was the only Native ranger there to do interpretation of the pictographs and stuff. And people will always ask, there's one pictograph that looks kind of like a fish or like a wolf or something like that, you know? People asked about it all the time. That's what they assumed. And then so she was like, you know, I vaguely recall that my elders said there's something different. So she asked around her elders, and she found it actually wasn't a fish or a wolf. It's actually a map. It was a map of some sacred sites that, and the teeth of the wolf/fish were actually mountains, sacred mountains or sacred hills. That map showed the location of those. And there's no way, looking at that, you would come up with that unless you have that oral history handed down to interpret it. You know, no one from the outside would be able to know that thing, you know. That's the kind of like amazing insight that is like, I mean, it's sort of like, it's almost like Indiana Jones style archaeology, like, oh my God, look at this thing, it's a treasure map to this incredible thing. But still, that kind of insight exists, and we only have access to it. It only still exists in the world if we have storytellers. You know, she was an interpreter at the park and not a you know, a photographer or a journalist, but those worlds are merging as we bring storytellers in from their own communities.
Well, I have a lot more questions for you. I started thinking we're hitting close to the hour mark, so we need
Okay.
I was wondering, just a very micro question. So do you have teams of Indigenous people that you find wherever you are photographing, where you'll be like kind of mentoring them so they take over this?
Yeah, everywhere I go, generally there's young people who are interested, you know, in media jobs and like media work nowadays. It's not like the world, especially in the last 5 years, things have really changed. The last 5-10 years, the kind of technology has gotten more accessible. Cameras have gotten cheaper, and Instagram and social media has brought this kind of world to everyone's doorstep. Now the infrastructure has gotten better. Like even some of the remote Cofán villages, not all of them, but some of them have internet, like one tiny little one tiny little hut that you have to stand next to in the middle of the in the middle of the heat and the sun in order to get. So it's, which I think is actually kind of nice, because it means they can get their internet but not spend their lives on the internet. But they see that this kind of stuff is being created, and so yeah, there's opportunities to mentor, and certainly it's something that I have been doing. I take my time out. I often actually try to use them as fixers or interpreters, or people. They often, like, because they know their community really well, and it gives me the opportunity to work with them, not just from the point of view like, here's something that I can use, but here's an opportunity for you to be around and see how we work at this really high level. This is something you should to think about. And I'm also trying to really encourage these young people to think bigger. A lot of Indigenous peoples are really used to thinking small and local, which of course is the whole point of being Indigenous. You know, lowercase I Indigenous is about being of the place. So local is what it's all about. But I am trying to encourage them to think bigger, because you can't, not only can you not build a career out of just reporting on your own place, but even bigger than that, they're going to have insights to other communities, close or even far away, that no one else is going to have. And their ability to see those things is really powerful. So we both have the current project I'm on, National Geographic, is something called a second assistant program. So we actually hire Indigenous assistants for each leg of the journey, every place that I go. It hasn't been possible to hire an Indigenous assistant, but at the very least a local, someone who's from that region or area specifically. You know, all of this is still building. We're bringing photo camps to some of these areas to train young people who are interested in this kind of stuff. You know, everyone has a camera phone now, so like you have the ability to report on this kind of stuff. That the technology has gotten so that people can do it. So it's just a question of learning the technical aspects, which is, I think, probably the easiest thing for people to learn and tackle. The harder part of it is to learn how to do the storytelling, and part of that also involves just people, these young people, learning to think bigger and to think more abstract.
Well, yeah. I was just gonna let the last question be: is there anything you would like to share that I didn't ask? Is there a question you wish I would have asked of my other questions? Is there something you really want to share with the world about your journey, or just you, or something you wish the world would understand that you have been, a vision that you've seen from the work that you've done?
To be honest, I think that you have been extremely insightful and asked all kinds of really good questions that I normally don't get in any kind of interview. So they're great. Thank you for that already. I'd say that I think that there's one insight I wanted to share. It's just that in general, even though we're talking about like at a place like National Geographic, we might get 6 months to work on a huge story that's up for multiple years. 6 months over 2 or 3 years of work. I guess this project I'm on right now is probably 10 months over 2 years. But regardless, that is, National Geographic is kind of the last one standing. It's like the last publication that is willing to send people, has the funding to send people out for these long, deep immersions. And it's a really big shame. I think it's, I think people should realize that the kind of reporting that we have now just doesn't really afford us the time to go deep. People distrust media precisely because we don't get enough time to do things really deeply and correctly anymore. The more resource places that can do it do. But yeah, like, sure, the New York Times can do this kind of stuff deeply, but they have a very short period of time to do it in. And they have a ton of resources to throw at it. but that's fine when you're covering like whatever, an election cycle or something like that. It's not really fine when you're covering things that are much, much deeper, and that are about different cultures for whom you don't get insider views on. And so I hope that people out there are able to support the few publications that are out there that are still standing, that allow us to actually do this kind of work. So even if someone comes from the inside, if you come from your own culture, you still need a lot of time in order to do it right. there's no getting around it. The best pictures, the best journalism, the best stories, all this kind of stuff comes from that. And I think the flip side of it also is that people are also not paying attention to long form stories anymore because of our attention spans. And I think that ultimately this is kind of a big problem. And I encourage people to subscribe to print magazines, not because it helps support the magazine itself, but honestly, just because it's a better way to read. Like, yeah, the New Yorkers, like, we remember the time when the New Yorkers used to pile up in the bathroom or whatever, and you never read them, you feel guilty about it. But having the New Yorker there, like sitting there where you like read a couple of pages while you're eating lunch or something like that, and it's still open, it's got a bookmark, you come back and you'll finish reading it. And that's like, we need that training in our lives again, just to know what it's like to read something longer. And I mean, it's just an article and then a story in the New Yorker, right? It's not that many words, let alone a book. But I notice this in myself as well as all the people around me. It doesn't matter how much great work we do if no one is out there to read it. You know, if we've all lost our attention spans to the point where we can only pay attention to the 196 characters or whatever, you know, on Twitter. So,
I appreciate your work, and getting to know you has been great. And I know that you're doing it right.
Thanks,
when
Jim.
That you don't really care so much what the audience thinks when they read it, as much as the first reaction from the people that you're representing is more important. That's the first thing. That's a big difference. And what a different world journalism would have, and documentary, photography, film, all the arts would have if they gave that primacy to the people who are in the art, making it with you.
I think there's a certain level of accountability too that's really good. That happens, you know, like being in the Indigenous world, everyone knows who, not everyone, but, you know, people generally figure out who I am fairly quickly. And so, like, I can't get away with doing stuff that isn't right. Whereas you're kind of sort of pseudo-anonymous reporter that comes in from the outside who the Indigenous world isn't deeply tuned into, they can get away with it because they'll disappear, and it doesn't matter if community gets mad at them. If they never go back there again, it's no big deal to them, right? Yeah. But on that note, incidentally, I was a little nervous when this came out. It was like, we're reporting on so many different nations, and yeah, I got to spend lots of time with them. But it's like, you know, native Twitter can be harsh with the criticism, and I was a little concerned about it. But, you know, I think I felt like we did a good job when it wasn't very long afterwards, like just a few weeks after the story came out, that people started sending me pictures. Friends of mine started sending me pictures from powwows where there were bootleg T-shirts with that National Geographic cover on it. And I was like, all right, that's a good sign. You're doing good in the world. Like, no award or recognition could be better than that, right? That's how you know you're doing a good job. Yeah.
Thanks for getting on the show, and we appreciate you taking time for this conversation. Great luck, and we'll follow your work.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, it's been great chatting. Absolutely. Oh, yeah.